Subcommittee will come to order, and good afternoon to everyone. The world is experiencing an unprecedented crisis of international religious freedom, a crisis that has and continues to create hundreds of millions of victims, a crisis that undermines liberty, prosperity, and peace, a crisis that poses a direct challenge to the U.S. interests in the Middle East, Central and East Asia, Russia, China, and Sub-Saharan Africa, to name just a few. In large parts of the world, this fundamental freedom is constantly and brutally under siege. The worldwide erosion of respect for this fundamental freedom is the cause of widespread human suffering, grave injustices, refugee flows, and significant threats to peace. This Congress has heard the cries of Iraqi and Syrian Christians who face the threat of extinction, slavery, and death. We have heard about the plight of Rohingya Muslims who face attacks and such unimaginable discrimination from hardline Buddhist groups that many choose slavery elsewhere than life in Burma. We have heard about the persecution faced by Chinese Christians, Tibetan Buddhists, Uyghur Muslims, and Falun Gong at the hands of the Communist Party, suspicious of organized religion. And many of us on this subcommittee have seen firsthand the religious dividing lines in Sub-Saharan Africa that are the cause of so much death and destruction, especially by groups like Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram. In a world where some people are willing to kill those whose beliefs differ from theirs, where anti-Semitism persists even in the most tolerant of places, and where authoritarian governments view strong religious faith as a potential threat to their legitimacy, it is more important than ever that the United States engage in robust religious freedom diplomacy, one that uses all the tools available enshrined in the landmark International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. The stakes are too high and the suffering too great to downplay religious freedom as a priority in U.S. foreign policy. But unfortunately, we often hear from religious groups globally and from NGOs working on the issue that this administration has sidelined the promotion of religious freedom. This criticism does not discount the exemplary work done by our men and women at the State Department and the efforts of Ambassador Sapperstein himself. They do important and substantive work, but it seems too often that the issue is marginalized and isolated from issues of national security or economic development, even though we know from academic research that countries with the highest levels of religious freedom experience more prosperity and less terrorism. Religious persecution has catastrophic consequences for religious communities and for individual victims. But it also undermines the national security of the United States. Without religious freedom, aspiring democracies will continue to face instability. Sustained economic growth will be more difficult to achieve. Obstructions will remain to the advancement of the rights of women and girls. And perhaps most urgent of all, religious terrorism will continue to be nourished and exported. The global religious freedom crisis will not disappear anytime soon. According to the nonpartisan Pew Research Center, 75% of the world's population live in countries where severe religious persecution occurs regularly. It has been almost 17 years since the passage of the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. For the record, I chaired virtually every one of the hearings that led to its passage. And as we all know, it was authored by Congressman Frank Wolf, a tremendous advocate for religious freedom, and of course the author of that landmark law. Religious freedom diplomacy has developed under 3 administrations of both parties. Unfortunately, the grim global realities demonstrate that our nation has had little effect on the rise of persecution and the decline of religious freedom. And it is worth asking why. Is it worth asking not only what the State Department is doing, but more importantly, what could be done better? Are new tools and new ideas needed to help U.S. religious freedom diplomacy address one of the great crises of the 21st century? Does the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998 need to be upgraded to reflect 21st century realities? That is why I introduced the Frank Wolf International Religious Freedom Act of 2015. This legislation, named after the author, as I mentioned a moment ago, of the original IRFA Act, would, among other things, strengthen the role of the Ambassador at Large for Religious Freedom and the International Religious Freedom Office at State, and give more tools to the administration to address the crisis we face. Pardon me. The bill is roundly endorsed and supported by a broad, diverse array of religious freedom, civil society, and diaspora organizations. They acknowledge what too many policymakers and administrations, Republican and Democratic alike, have been unable to appreciate. America's first freedom ought to be infused at every possible level into our foreign policy. Upgrading and strengthening U.S. international religious freedom policy and further integrating it into U.S. foreign policy and national security strategy will send a clear message that the U.S. will fight for the inherent dignity of every human being and against the global problems of persecution, religious extremism, and terrorism. In so doing, we can advance the best of our values while protecting vital national interests. I'd like to yield to Mr. Cicilline for any opening comments he might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you and Ranking Member Bass for your leadership and for calling today's hearing on the global crisis of religious freedom to give us an opportunity to discuss the current state of religious freedoms throughout the world. And while the hearing title suggests solely a focus on crises, it's my hope that we might also hear about examples of positive trends in policy development and successful efforts to open spaces for religious expression all across the world. Spirituality and deeply held religious beliefs are central to the lives of billions of people in the world, and the freedom to hold those beliefs without fear of persecution is essential for the respect of basic human rights. I want to offer my appreciation to today's witnesses for agreeing to participate in this hearing, including Ambassador David Sapperstein from the United States State Department and Mr. Robert George, Chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. I commend your dedication and commitment to ensuring religious freedom in the world as an extension of the ethos that the human rights of all people, regardless of race, creed, sexual orientation, or political affiliation, must be respected. I look forward to hearing your perspectives on the status of displaced persons on the continent, the status of religious freedom in the world, and the impact it has had on the human rights of all people. In a time when sectarian violence rages within and between various world religions and the repression of religious minorities persists, it's critical that we raise awareness of these challenges, as well as offering continuous support to national, regional, and global institutions which seek to address these issues. The infringement of religious beliefs and exercise goes beyond just a human rights violation. It poses a threat to national and regional peace and stability and creates conditions for marginalization and poverty within persecuted groups, as well as so many other negative consequences on the individual and on society. Whether it's the desecration of mosques, churches, or synagogues, or the defamation of violent assault against adherents of particular religious groups, it's critical to provide oversight and forward-thinking policy in these matters to ensure that we can help to expand religious freedoms worldwide. As a proud representative from the state of Rhode Island, a state founded by Roger Williams in pursuit of religious liberty, this is an issue particularly important to me and to my constituents. And I know that I stand with all of my colleagues in Congress in our commitment to uphold the religious freedoms and to expand global human rights. And I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses today, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I'd like to now yield to the chairman of the Subcommittee on Eurasia and Emerging Threats, Dana Rohrabacher.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your stalwart efforts over the years on the issues of human rights, but particularly on this particular human right, which is the right to worship God or not worship God according to one's own conscience. And you've played such an important role. You personally have saved thousands of lives, and I want to thank you for that. And people ought to know that our activism here has an impact overseas for people who are living in a shadow of tyranny and repression and murder. We have today, of course, in the past, we know that suppression of religious freedom has always been part of the human condition. We know that the history of Christians, even 1,000 years ago, we had Christian armies slaughtering each other or going into separate countries and slaughtering the Huguenots for killing the Catholics and et cetera, et cetera. I'm pleased to say, thanks to people like you in the United States and in the Western world, we have put that behind us now. And it's important that America needs to lead the way on issues like this. And today, of course, we face an enormous challenge. And that challenge is that Christians in the Middle East in particular are being targeted for extinction They are targeted for genocide. And we know that during the communist era, that the communists who we helped defeat wanted an atheist dictatorship and were responsible for murdering millions of people, but of all faiths, I might add. But today, we have the threat of our generation is to cope with the rise of radical Islamic terrorism, which is targeting Christians in the Middle East for extinction. And unless we act, those people who represent a culture, represent a large portion, a large population of people who worship God, will be wiped out. Genocide will be successful. Now, we have some challenges with Muslims, like in Burma and elsewhere. Muslims are being denied their rights. We need to acknowledge that. But we need to tell the Muslim world without hesitation that this fight with Christianity, to the point that they are exterminating Christians in Syria and elsewhere. The church, when Morsi was in charge there in Egypt, they were burning down Catholic churches. This has got to stop. I have a piece of legislation that I'd like to work with you, Mr. Chairman, on. I have one that's the sense of the House, that the Christian community in the Middle East are targets of genocide, and that our immigration policy from that part of the world should put anyone who's a target of genocide at the top of the list of priorities of being admitted to the United States. And that's the sense of the House. I am currently working on a resolution that would actually change the basic law, immigration law, to reflect that priority. If people are targeted for extermination, targeted for genocide, we should make them a priority to offer the safe haven of the United States, which we're so proud of, that we have been the shining light and the refuge to the world. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Chairman Rohrabacher. And just for the record, thank you for all of your leadership going back to your days as speechwriter for Ronald Reagan. But just last week, we met with Prime Minister Sharif from Pakistan, and I followed you, but you led very, very effectively in raising issues of religious persecution and blasphemy laws and the like, and I want to thank you for that leadership. I'd like to now yield to Dan Donovan, who's a former district attorney for Staten Island, but now a member of Congress and a welcome member of the subcommittee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and show you how smart my mother and father raised me. I'm not going to speak after somebody who wrote speeches for President Reagan. We're very interested in hearing the witnesses' testimony, so I'll yield my time until further into the proceedings. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Donovan. I'd like to now welcome our very distinguished first witness, Rabbi David Sapperstein, who is Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. He was confirmed by the Senate on December 12, 2014, sworn in and assumed his duties on January 6th of this year. Ambassador Sapperstein previously served for 40 years as the Director of Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, a rabbi and an attorney for 35 years. Rabbi Sapperstein taught seminars in First Amendment church-state law and in Jewish law at Georgetown University Law Center. He has served on the boards of numerous national organizations, including the NAACP. In 1999, Ambassador Sapperstein served as the first chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and he has been a great friend of this Committee on Human Rights, this chairman, and many of us in the House and Senate. And I want to thank him for his leadership and yield the floor to him.
Well, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'm honored to be here. Mr. Cicilline, Mr. Donovan, Mr. Rohrabacher, and my compliments to the ranking member, Bass, for the extraordinary work she's done as well. I'm honored to appear before you today on International Religious Freedom Day and the 70th anniversary of the IRFA Act here. Mr. Chairman, you did play, and everyone should know it, an extraordinary role in the passage of that and in urging its effective implementation and empowering the effective implementation in all these years. It's been an honor to have had the opportunity to work with you over these years. It's a connection I cherish deeply. The law has had a significant impact on the way religious freedom is viewed, not only in the United States, but around the world. In far too many countries, people face the kind of daunting, alarming, growing challenges you have all so articulately described. In countries with proud traditions of multi-faith cooperation, often for centuries, where positive coexistence was once the norm, we've witnessed growing numbers of religious minorities being driven out of their historic homeland. And in too many countries, prisoners of conscience suffer cruel punishment, torture for their religious beliefs and practices. Now, in our report this year, there are several key trends I'd like to lift up and highlight. First is the abhorrent acts of terror committed by those who falsely claim the mantle of religion to justify their wanton destruction. The action of non-state actors in this regard is the fastest growing challenge to religious freedom worldwide. In Iraq and Syria, ISIL has sought to eliminate anyone assessed as deviating from its own violent and destructive interpretation of Islam. The group is displaced over 1 million from their homes based solely on their religion or opposition to ISIL's interpretations, be they Sunni or Shia. Shia were targeted by ISIL. Christians or Yazidis also targeted by ISIL, or any one of the many other ethno-religious groups for whom Iraq and Syria are home, and they are suffering greatly. The Turkmens, the Biamendian, the Kakais, the Shabak, and the others. The victims' stories are deeply troubling. When I was in Iraq, the first trip that I took as the ambassador at large for international freedom, I heard the story of an 18-year-old Yazidi woman from Mosul whom ISIL fighters kidnapped and raped. I heard this from members of her village, her family. She was then taken to Kocho, a village near Sinjar Mountain, where the fighters separated out the village's men and boys over 12 years old, and as she watched helplessly, lined them up next to shallow ditches and shot them all. After a while, her cell phone stopped working. We do not know this poor woman's ultimate fate. What we do know is that that same story has replayed itself countless numbers of times with other victims. We talk about the numbers, but every one of those numbers is a human being. Every one of those numbers represents the most horrific suffering that we can imagine. We continue to see the negative impact, secondly, of blasphemy and apostasy laws in countries including Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Sudan. Such laws have been used in some countries as a pretext to justify violence in the name of religion, which can lead to false claims of blasphemy, create an atmosphere of impunity for those in social hostilities who choose to resort to violence. Repressive governments routinely subject their citizens to violence, detention, discrimination, undue surveillance for simply exercising their faith or identifying with a religious community. We see this dramatized by those countless number of prisoners of conscience, and we are deeply committed to seeing them free everywhere in the world. In China, members of unregistered religious and spiritual groups, their advocates, including Falun Gong, the house churches, continue to face widespread harassment, detention, and imprisonment. This reality has only been exacerbated by the growing crackdown on human rights lawyers in China, including those seeking to work within China's legal system to enhance religious freedom, such as the human rights lawyer Zhang Kai, who was arrested just before he and a group of other religious and human rights activists were to meet with me on my trip. Many governments have also used the guise of confronting terrorism or violent extremism to justify repression of religious groups, nonviolent religious activities, or imposition of broad restrictions on religious life. Chinese officials have increased controls on Uyghur Muslims' peaceful religious expression and practice, including reported instances of restricting the ability to fast during Ramadan, banning beards and headscarves. Tibetan Buddhists face government interference under the under the cause of combating separatism. Societal violence and discrimination continue to shape the government's vital role in protecting religious freedom. Even though these are not actions facilitated by the government, governments are responsible under international law to take appropriate action to ameliorate the conditions that lead to such violence and protect harassed minority communities. And as you indicated, even in Europe, many governments are struggling to cope with the aftermath of terror attacks such as those in France, Belgium, and Denmark. And at the same time, hundreds of thousands of Syrians, Afghans, Iraqis, others have fled into Europe in the past months. We urge governments to uphold their obligations to protect the human rights of refugees and migrants in their countries and take steps to prevent them from facing official harassment and discrimination on account of their religion. We are deeply inspired by the works of countless religious communities, civil society groups, and individuals around the world who hold their governments accountable for international commitments to protect freedom of religion and belief. This remains the driving force behind our work. During my confirmation last year, I described several key goals. We've made progress on many of them in no small measure thanks to the support on Capitol Hill. First, we have been working successfully to build partnerships with other nations to advance religious freedom together, since these global challenges require a global response. With the leadership of my good friend, Canadian Ambassador for Religious Freedom, Bennett, we have forged the International Governmental Contact Group on freedom of religion and belief, drawing from every hemisphere, from countries with different majority religious traditions, to bring together nations to devise strategies to promote and protect religious freedom for all. And this parallels a parliamentary network, HELP, which our U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom has played such an important role in helping to shape. Second, we have strengthened significantly our programmatic work in an often overlooked but vital area of our work through the Human Rights and Democracy Fund and other funding sources. The Department supports an ever wider range of programs that have a direct impact on international religious freedom, countering intolerance, combating anti-Semitism, increasing public awareness, training civil society and government officials, strengthening the capacity of religious leaders to promote interfaith cooperation, empowering religious minorities to participate in political life, and combating religiously motivated discrimination and violence. Third, we have strengthened our focus on religious minority communities under siege. The Obama administration has appointed Knox Thames as our special advisor for religious minorities in the Near East and South and Central Asia. We have spoken out frequently about what it would take to allow minority communities displaced by violence to return home, and Special Advisor Thames is actively focusing on coordinating with government-wide efforts in this regard. Fourth, we are building our office's capacity to advance religious freedom worldwide. The Department of State has significantly increased the staffing of our office, allowing us to expand ongoing work and devote staff to not just for geographical focus to monitor countries across the globe, but to focus on thematic issues like the relationship between religious freedom, countering violent extremism, the negative effects of blasphemy and apostasy laws, intersection of women's equality and religious freedom. This has helped us engage every segment of the State Department and of the administration in integrated religious freedom into our nation's statecraft in areas far beyond just religious freedom itself. And fifth, we have maintained a very close cooperation with the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, represented here by its chair. He served a very exemplary role as chair prior to this. Robbie George, Professor Robert George, is one of this country's great public intellectuals, and it is always an honor and a pleasure to work closely with him. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, we continue to face these daunting, alarming, growing challenges. We are building new partnerships, investing in new programs, increasing our staff, coordinating with USERF. We face this task with continued vigor and resolve to ensure that everyone has the right to live in accordance with the dictates of his or her conscience. I thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Ambassador Sapperstein, thank you very much for your testimony. And because we do have votes that may come as early as 1:30 to 1:45, I'll lay out my questions and ask you to answer and ask others so that we can get to Mr. George or Professor George in a timely fashion. Let me, just a couple of questions to start off with. There is a perception, as you know, among many, the 2013 GAO report cited this concern as well, that religious freedom is not a high priority for this administration. Now, in a revelation of priorities, as a matter of fact, Robbie George did testify a couple of times before our subcommittee. At one point when, I mean, you're a breath of fresh air. We're so glad you sit in this very strategic position, but the problem has been for almost 3 years, nobody sat in that position. And CPC designations were not forthcoming, even though the act prescribed an annual designation. They simply didn't happen, and they didn't happen. So a lot of countries that should have been put on notice and held to account were not. And I'm wondering, in the system, how, I mean, you meet with Secretary Kerry? Does he take your phone calls? Is there an integration of religious freedom and religious persecution issues in all aspects? Does DOD do the same thing? Certainly, whether it be AFRICOM or any of our other efforts, I mean, many of our soldiers and service members are as much diplomats as they are warriors, and I'm wondering how integrated that is with your efforts. I know you travel. When you go to a country, you have an impact, but all the rest of the government, it's a whole of government approach, it would seem to me. Can you speak to that issue of whether or not it is? Some of the designations that the USCIRF has, and I and others have called for repeatedly, is Vietnam, Pakistan. We just met, as I mentioned, with the Prime Minister a few days ago, talking about blasphemy laws. I remember when the minister was gunned down in cold blood on his motorcycle some years ago, Shabazz Badi. I was with you. We were in mourning over his loss. Right. Pakistan has serious problems, and Vietnam got an upgrade in order to get into to get WTO and to get MFN, or PNTR as it's now called. I opposed it and said, let the record speak for itself. I went to Vietnam, met with a lot of people. A lot of those that I met with are now in jail now. Again, like Father Lee, who unfortunately had another show trial, as you know so well. I mean, Vietnam ought to be a CPC. What we do in terms of implementing and sanctioning is purely up to the administration, but the designation itself ought to be done without any other consideration of a foreign policy. And maybe if you'd speak to the pattern. I wrote the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. We have a hearing in this committee on November 4th. John Shattuck, who was the Assistant Secretary back in the Clinton administration for human rights, testified right where you sit against Frank Wolf's bill, against it, on the record. You know, it was baffling to look back. He was against it. I've often thought there are a whole lot of people who still haven't said this is something we need to work on within state that patterns that suggest that. On the trafficking bill, 2 countries at least, 3 at least, Indonesia, Cuba, and China, didn't get Tier 3, egregious violator of trafficking, even though the record is absolutely Malaysia, I should say. Malaysia was because of the TPP, Cuba because of our rapprochement that we've engaged in, and China because we don't want to offend China, which is ludicrous. On the child abduction law that I wrote, the Sean and David Goldman International Child Abduction Prevention and Return Act, Japan mysteriously dropped off, even though there's 50 cases, because of other considerations. And I'm wondering from your perch, and I don't want to get you fired, but do you see that there's a reluctance to really engage these issues? And Vietnam jumps off the page. They need our help. You know, China threatens them as never before, and it seems that there's an effort to try to build bridges there. Well, calling them out on their persecution seems to me to be a very important thing to do. So if you could, this pattern troubles me when it comes to these fundamental human rights issues and the clear points of, and again, even on China, as you know, China is in a race to the bottom with North Korea when it comes to human rights. We just issued, I chair the China Commission, we just put out our annual report on October 8th. It's chilling, horrifying reading on every human rights point, including religious persecution, and they seem to be getting, even the Patriotic Church and the Three Self movement are being attacked now, and they were supposed to be protected by the government. So if you could speak to some of those issues, I'd appreciate it.
All right, let me take a run at some of these as quickly as I can. First, the integration issue. It used to be a fight to talk with the government over the last 15 years about how connected religious freedom was with so many other concerns we've had. I was really heartened when I arrived to find it is no longer a fight here. It is absolutely clear to everyone you cannot deal with combating violent extremism, with countering terrorism, here. If you can have sectarian violence in a country, if you have large numbers of people shut out of participation in a country because of what their religious beliefs are, it is absolutely clear you cannot build democracies, you cannot have effective conflict resolution when you have groups of people who have to choose between abiding by the laws of the country and living out their lives in accordance with their religious conscience, where again, they don't feel they can affirm their lives in that country by following the system. And when that happens, they're filled with the kind of frustration and despair that makes them fertile field for extremists. This is widely understood now in the State Department. And the work of my colleague Sean Casey on the Religion and Global Affairs effort that virtually doubles the number of people at the State Department working on the broader religious issues here. I have a staff of, depending on how you count them, 20, 25 people with part-time people who help write the report, even a little larger than that. Sean has a staff that size. Together, it gives us a formidable ability to really continue to work closely with all the different arms. Almost all of them are really appreciative, not just open, but appreciative of that, recognize you have to deal with these issues. It is a different day today. Is it still clumsy for many people? Yes. These are very hard issues to deal with in an effective manner. I also have to say that I've been struck by, in every country I've been to, and I presume it's been your experience as well in your travels, how robust is the engagement of the embassies on an ongoing basis with the religious communities. When we were pulled together with the religious leaders, they were greeted with open arms. They were greeted with, people that they really knew and knew them. I think that's one of the great contributions of what you did with the report. Think about it. Every year, at least 200, 199, 193 embassies have to, or consulates, have to assign staff to draft the report. They have to be in touch with beleaguered religious community or oppressed religious community. When I traveled in 2000 here, that was the most common refrain I had. We now have somebody to talk to. We never had anyone to talk to. We know someone in the embassy that we can talk to. Over the years, thousands of our, well over 1,000 Foreign Service officers have had to immerse themselves in this kind of work. They're all over the place now here. So we find there is robust interaction in the embassies, far beyond what I imagined and I was aware of before I took this position. I find that to be really heartening as well here. Let me move on to your question about access and influence. I was given a choice of several different variants of how this might be arranged. I consulted with some very good people, Congressman Wolf, a little bit with yourself, with Tom Farr, others on this. They promised me before I took this job, I would have as much access as I want. I remember Representative Fortenberry asking the Secretary this question, and he said, I had to work for months to work it out for him to come on board. Do you think I did that where he's not going to have access? There's not been a time that I've reached up to the Secretary's staff, to the Secretary, to the other top staff, where I think within hours I've gotten a response, almost always appreciating, affirming what I asked for and providing what I requested. Here, I really, considering how busy they are, the fact that these responses come at the highest levels so quickly and so encouragingly and supportive to me kind of speaks volumes about that. They really have lived up to that promise. There's not a single time that I've been shut out where I wanted access. I've had the time, both formally and often, kind of step-asides with the Secretary where he says, what's going on here? Bring me up to speed here. What problems you have here, where I've been able to share those with him. So I've been very heartened and encouraged by that. I agree with you about the CPCs. I was clear about that in my testimony. I am pushing very hard to revamp the way that we do this. I do not think we're going to have this problem in the future here, and I think within a short period of time that will become clear. Let me get into some of the individual countries. It's really hard for me on the wonderful work on trafficking, which, as you know, in my prior life, here the coalition that met on this bill met in my offices. Here, you know how strongly I feel about the bill and how closely we worked on it, and same with your child abduction law. It's really not appropriate for me to answer some of these other questions. Obviously, everyone in government should always abide by what the law says in terms of implementing these.
If you could yield for 1 second, the concern is that there's a pattern. With Malaysia, it's the TPP, and there's no way that Malaysia can be a Tier 3 country and go forward with the TPP. Cuba, you know, we're making nice in Cuba, even though you read the trafficking narrative in the TIP report, and it's inescapable. It's a Tier 3 country. It's horrible. And yet they got a country.
I need to leave it, Mr. Chairman.
So Vietnam.
I need to leave it to you, with your great experience in this committee, with its great experience, to make the judgments about patterns. May I just offer one comment about it, however? It is absolutely true. There are problems that emerge over the years. They come in ebbs and flows. They change over the years, where things are not as implemented as effectively as we might hope. They remain the exceptions. We deal year after year with scores and scores of countries, some of whom we have deep relations with. We depend on for important interests, where we call it as it was intended to be. We name those countries, and your focus on the times that it's gone off base. I understand that. I would just offer that in the main, all of these things are working, and they are evoking change here in this. I mean, I remember in the very first year of the trafficking report, when Israel was named as a tier, many people said, close ally, shouldn't do, and then within a year, they had passed a series of laws, immediately took them out of it.
Same with South Korea.
And we could, you and I could name a score of times that off the top of our heads where this really has worked. So I leave it to you to draw the question about the problematic patterns, but I think we ought to really celebrate also the patterns that show enormous impact that these pieces of legislation you have helped draft have had to beleaguer people all across the globe. Let me just say a word about particularly Vietnam here. I found over the years that there are often not things that are right or wrong, but different truths that are in tension with each other. So your picture of Vietnam, I cannot argue with. From our report, I agree with everything that you were saying. There are other parts of the picture, however, that I saw when I was there, and we heard from different religious leaders. And as you know, I met with Father Lee in prison. He asked me to send his warmest regards to you and to express how much he appreciates the staunch support that you have given him. We visited other religious prisoners as well. If you visit Vietnam today and compare it to when I was there last a number of years ago, or to people who really know the country well and your own visits 15 years ago, wherever I traveled, the churches are bursting at the seams. In small rural areas of the country, in the cities, here the churches are filled. Here, there is a vibrancy and power, often filled with young families, that is truly inspiring against all of these restrictions. In the face of all of these restrictions, they at least allow for this kind of life to happen. And we have found that these restrictions that you've talked about are imposed very unevenly around the country. There are many areas where the hand of government is much lighter here. And in those areas, the religious communities are organizing, they contribute to the society, able to provide social services. Here, there are extraordinary things that are going on here. But you go to another city, and they crack down all the time and throw in jail the unregistered churches. Here, we're in another city, they kind of turn a blind eye so long as it's not fragrant. That wouldn't have happened 15 years ago. There was no room, no space for any of that. Here, so we are focused right now on using TPP where there's been an openness for improvements on human rights in several areas, on labor law, on disability rights, and other things that we've been engaged with Vietnam on, where TPP has been a lever to get them to sign international accords and treaties they've never signed before, to reform some of the rule of law issues that we've been pushing on for years. We're pushing very hard on religious freedom. I hope everyone knows that Vietnam is now undertaking a complete revision of their religious law, their religion law. On the one hand, there are parts of it that are positive. Here, it would add provisions allowing for religious training facilities, the explicit right for religious institutions to raise money for the first time. It would permit clergy to organize religious ceremonies more extensively than it does. It gives prisoners religious rights that it never gave before. On the other hand, in the main, it didn't make the reforms that you have been calling for and we have been calling for. The same regulatory system that controls every aspect of life. Who can go to seminary, what they can teach, who can be appointed as a leader of a church. If you don't have the right to appoint your own clergy, how can you really have religious freedom? Here, the requirement to report everything you're planning to do for a year with every deviance from it having to be approved by the government. We have offered a number of suggestions of how to push that. We've done that in consultation with the religious leadership of Vietnam. Here, we really hope that they will make improvements that will change it from permission to notification. If they want to keep some awareness and control, at least let the religious communities notify them what to do and move ahead. They ought to have a restriction that says if they are asked for approval for something, if it doesn't come by the time the law says, that becomes a stamp of approval. Otherwise, people wait for years and years for permission to do things. And to ease the restrictions on the unregistered churches, so long as they don't violate some other kind of law here. So we're pushing very hard. One of the big problems is some of the restrictions are written so vaguely, it allows the government to crack down on whatever it wants to do. You can't have a legal system that does that. It can't have overbroad, vague rules controlling religious life this way. So we're working to support the religious community and the NGO community that are pushing hard for these reforms. Let's see what happens on this here. It is an issue of a country of key priority for us here, and we will continue to keep our focus on it.
I thank you. Before yielding, Mr. Cicilline, I would just note, immediately prior to the bilateral trade agreement, Vietnam was taken off the list by the previous administration, so there's no partisan effort here. And very quickly, the day after they won that treaty, or won that benefit, there was a snapback. And the people who had signed the Block 8406, the Human Rights Manifesto, many of the religious freedom people that I met with on my last trip there, which was right before the bilateral trade agreement, were all thrown into jail again. And so it's the lack of durability, and CPC, I would respectfully say, doesn't mean you have to prescribe penalties. You have the option.
Yes.
But the designation is just to be a snapshot. What are they doing? And it seems to me that they have not made the grade, but we'll agree to disagree. Ms. Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador, for your testimony. I have three subjects that I'd like to cover, and I know I have other colleagues that are here, so I'll try to move through them quickly. You made reference to the sort of, I think, some sense that you are revamping or revising the CPC designation process. If you could speak to that. I mean, I do think there is some evidence of some unevenness in this process, and certainly USCIRF has made recommendations about a greater number of countries being designated, and I recognize there are waivers that are granted, but I'd also like to hear your thoughts on the impact of waivers, particularly waivers which sometimes seem to be permanent. And so, you know, the whole notion behind this, and it's obviously worked successfully, is to identify countries of concern, to sort of raise the profile of the issue, and as a consequence, compel them to change their behavior or take action. So the kind of even and predictable way in which this is done, in the sense that it's being done annually, as at least the legislation suggests, and then the impact of waivers. So that's one. The second thing is, if you would just speak to what I think is a growing concern for many of us, and that is the action of non-state actors, who very often are some of the worst violators of religious freedom, and obviously in places sometimes where a government is really non-existent, or functioning government is non-existent. What are the tools available for us to impact that situation? And should we consider being able to designate a region, even if it doesn't have an actual government responsible, as a place of concern, which I'm not sure the current statute provides? And finally, what are the most effective tools that you have, and what more can Congress do to enhance the objective of your responsibilities? And what are the most effective ways to do it? And that may include some of the recommendations that were made in the International Religious Freedom Report I just released. So if you could just address those three, I appreciate it.
Yeah. Very quickly, there is an agreement that we need to kind of standardize and regularize the CPC process. We haven't quite completed that yet. I can't comment on the internal deliberations, but we're trying to move ahead in a way that I think you will feel good about when we when we're able to talk a little more openly about it. It's part of the process of the CPC determinations. We not only provide internal guidance to all of those in the decision-making process in my office, in DRL, through all the regional desks, all the way up to the secretary, but also the analyses of NGOs, of religious communities, and most particularly of USERF. We take the Commission's recommendations of what the CPCs ought to see. They're seen by everyone, including the argumentation for it, as part of our process. And I just want people to know about that. In terms of the impact of when waivers are given, the sanctions are only one tool that we have in our programmatic work, in which we strengthen civil society and religious groups able to fight for their rights more effectively, where we move together with international cooperation as we strengthen these international arms to work together to focus so that countries that have better relations with some countries we may not, here can be effective in terms of fighting for the expansion of human rights and religious freedom. All of these are weapons that are tools that are available to us to do that work. We have this panoply of tools, and when sanctions aren't going to be imposed because of national interest, national security purposes, then we use these other tools as robustly as we possibly can. Non-state actors are a major challenge for us. We have very little control and leverage with them. They're not in diplomatic relations with us. We obviously, in countries like Iraq, are committed to strengthening the governments there to fight against these groups, the same with those who face Boko Haram, who face al-Shabaab. Here, we're working with the governments to try and use the best techniques that we can train them in, to provide resources for them, to learn from best practices elsewhere, to help coordinate efforts of countries in the surrounding areas together, to try and be more effective in the work that we do on those. But this is an evolving crisis that we will be spending more and more time on. I've been encouraged to see how in the State Department, and I know in our intelligence agencies and defense world, we really have mobilized around these issues. We are in touch on an ongoing basis with the defense apparatus, particularly vis-a-vis the Near East, Iraq and Syria, here, and with the intelligence agencies in terms of working together on this. I think you'll be very heartened to know the extent of the cooperation on the sharing of our relevant perspectives and sharing of information on this. What more? I mean, I think there are ideas you'll have to take a look and evaluate based on what we've heard here in your bill about what can be done. That Ms. Frank-Wolfbull here. There are other bills around. There are some good ideas in those, and you should obviously take a look at that. Obviously, anytime resources to the State Department are expanded, it is helpful to us. I want to say what I said over and over again every time I've testified. There is extraordinary work being done at the State Department. There are not enough resources in some of the most vital areas that we have. When we're forced to take from one good area to another good area, including to religious freedom, it really hurts our overall mission. here. So where there are additional resources putting in of the work that you think is most helpful, it really makes a difference in our ability to do it. And I'm feeling that by the funds that the department was able to free up to allow us to significantly expand our staff that will really significantly strengthen our work.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Rohrbacher?
Thank you very much. Just to reiterate, I believe that at this particular moment, when we're discussing religious freedom in the world, that the overriding issue and attention needs to be on the Christians in the Middle East who are literally targeted for genocide. And we can see that, and we need to deal with that more than, that's my priority with that. But in terms of the broader scope of religious freedom, with the fall of communism, and basically Marxism, Leninism was an atheist philosophy of trying to superimpose an atheist dictatorship on the world. They killed many believers of all faiths, and we can be happy that that part of the human history has been, as Ronald Reagan said, been put into the ash heap of history. And there has been progress made in Vietnam, but there's a long way to go, as you expressed, that the very laws that are applicable to all other elements of a controlled society are applied to them. Thank you for that insight. I think it's important for us to realize those controls are being used by people who fundamentally are atheists of the communist nature who now are in power, and they have this bias against, the guys in power have this bias against Christians because they were part of the communist tide that was going to sweep the world. In terms of, but let me ask you about Russia. That was the heart of it, and it's where it started. I've been to Russia several times in the last couple of years, and I've been meeting with religious leaders every time, and they're reporting to me that they have relative freedom of religion in Russia now. What would your reaction to that be?
Like many countries around the globe, it is a mixed story. For those that are recognized in Russia, there is a good modicum of ability to live their lives in accordance with their freedom. But in the name of anti-terrorism and anti-separatism, the Russian government also has cracked down on some Muslims, some minority groups, and we understand legitimate concerns about terrorism. Here, we support countries dealing with them, but when they crack down by cracking down on peaceful religious practice as kind of an inoculation against letting anything flourish that might lead down a path that they fear towards this, it really becomes problematic.
It is a very difficult line to draw, what you're talking about.
It is.
Because in Russia, they even, I mean, as I say, I've been met with religious leaders. This is my last couple of visits. And the Mormons, even the Mormons said, "Oh no, we're fine. We can knock on doors and seek converts." And the only group that was complaining were the Scientologists, which, of course, is a question in Germany as well. And but in terms of trying to deal with the Islamic threat at a time, we realize it's very easy to see our friends in Saudi Arabia have been sponsoring mosques in order to promote radical Islam, and changing the society, and not just to get together to help people worship God together. And this is where you draw that line of how you deal with people who are trying to manipulate the Islamic faith towards a political radical end. That's a very difficult line to draw.
We agree it's a difficult line to draw, and clearly one of the tests ought to be where peaceful people are acting peaceably. They ought to be allowed to live in accordance with their religious conscience.
Correct.
Here, where they are violating laws here that have to do with criminal activity and terrorist activity, then those should be addressed directly. about it. We have found in a number of countries, including Russia, that is an overbroad crackdown on segments of the community. And they also have a registration process that can be tough. There are smaller groups, Jehovah's Witnesses, other groups,
Right.
who really are feeling enormous pressure.
That was the second group that was
Here,
place, yeah.
and here, in this regard as well. So some of the smaller groups are really having problems. And you have the same thing if you're talking about those categories of countries. In China, China still only recognizes 5 major faiths. Here, if you're not one of those faiths, you risk going to jail if you try to function openly.
I was just
there.
about to bring up China, so thank you for that analysis. One last note on China. Yes, they have to be part of those 5 recognized faiths, but do we not also still see a massive repression of, for example, the Falun Gong in China? Wouldn't that be under the umbrella of a religious freedom?
I mean, it's why I named it in my testimony here. There are still thousands of Falun Gong in prison, including most of their leadership. Here, many of them are in prisons where we do not know where they are. Here, and their families and their lawyers can contact it. There are many reported stories of torture and deaths in prison here. But this, we're seeing, similar kinds of repression vis-a-vis the Tibetan Buddhists and the Uyghur Muslims. And as I said last in Vietnam, it's uneven around the country. There are some places the government hand is lighter, and you see religious publishing houses and social services, and there are other places and unregistered churches able to function. But in the main in China, unregistered churches are always in danger of being arrested. And we have this extraordinary situation in Wenzhou, where one of the deepest concentration of Christians in one area in China, where they're pulling down crosses over hundreds, about 1,500 churches, and demolishing churches in the name of urban reclamation here. And they talk about it being only a small percentage of all the buildings, but 1,500 out of the 6,000 churches there is 20% of all the churches have been affected by this. And it's a clear effort to kind of repress the visible presence of the growing resurgence of religion of religious life in China.
Well, thank you very much for giving us that insight of that type of repression.
Thank you, Chairman Rohrabacher. Kurt Clausen, gentleman from Florida.
Thank you for coming in, and thank you for your service to our country.
Good to be with
I
you.
got 2 real quick questions, so if you'll,
Go ahead.
and I know Mark wants to go, so we'll go fast. First one's really easy. We read the information. We don't see anything about Mormons. And Mormons, they can get mocked on Broadway, and it doesn't matter. So I'm just curious. No one ever mentions them. There's, I think, millions of Mormons around the world. You never stumble across it, or it's off the radar, or what's the story there? It wasn't a trick question. I'm not.
No.
I'm just curious because of my own
I-
ancestors.
I respect that.
If you don't know, you don't know. You can let me know
let me-
another time. It's okay.
I'm pausing because I want to say something. I want to phrase what I'm saying complimentary about the Mormon Church. They are, because of their practice of young men and some women voluntarily going on mission, they have worked out more successfully than most religious groups a modus operandi to work with the powers that be here as effectively or more effectively than any other religious group that I can think of. They tend to run into problems, therefore. They try to play by whatever the rules are in a different country, and they're not as likely to push the envelope. So there are a score of countries I could name that do not allow any kind of religious expression other than here, the one that is the state-endorsed religious expression. Disproportionately, these are Muslim countries in which Mormon would be arrested if they went around doing the normal missionizing that they do. And since they don't tend to push the envelope, and test this, but recognize that that's not a country at this point they're able to function in.
Right.
They tend to run into this.
Got it.
That's why I paused.
Right. No. I mean, I know. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto the Lord what is the Lord's.
Indeed.
It's,
So they-
it's a good approach, irrespective. Now, let me ask one other question real briefly. I've read the material. I see you speaking. I look at the world in terms of global trade, and I struggle, and I like what you're doing. I like the program, because people ought to be able to go to church and kneel down and pray to whatever God. But it never seems to really impact any trade, and therefore anybody's bottom line. If you're China, you know, you're billions of dollars every month to the U.S. through Walmart. If you're the oil producers, you know, none of that ever gets impacted. Cuba's opening up. It feels like this is a program, you know, at a big picture level, I'm saying no one's bottom line with respect to trade is ever impacted, even though we're the world's growth engine. So what are we really doing here? And what am I missing about that? Because all the countries that you mentioned, there's a lot of Nike shoes being made in Vietnam. And all the toys and electronics are coming from China. They're the factory of the world. And whether they abuse folks' religious freedoms or not seems to mattereth not to the bottom line, which everyone respects. Am I missing the big picture completely here, or are we kind of, it's got to be a frustrating job for you? Tell me if I'm missing something here, because
You raised two issues here. Let me just say this, because it's been alluded to in some of the other comments. We are all committed to religious freedom, and that includes not only the right to worship. It includes the right to talk about your faith, to change your faith, to proselytize others. It includes, as someone said quite appropriately, the right not to believe as well. It is a broad right that goes beyond just the right to worship. Here, look, the system
are we moving the needle?
in some countries we are, in other countries we are not here, and we try to do everything we can to move the needle by strengthening the ability of religious groups to advocate for their rights, to work with civil society. We try to do it by our direct bilateral relations with these countries to improve rule of law issues on that. There are some countries we make real progress, other countries are much harder. We do use economic levers on this. There are a range of countries that are subject to sanctions here. So for instance, in Iran, here, that it is restricts a whole number of religious communities. We've lifted one set of sanctions, but all the human rights and religious freedom sanctions remain in place, and nothing under this agreement stops us from imposing more if the situation deteriorates even further than it does. There's a whole range of countries in which we do employ both human rights in general and religious freedom, particularly restraints sometimes in trade, other financial restraints, access to banking here, and other things that affect either the government or organizations that are involved in this violation of human rights, or individuals who are involved in these rights. They are fairly robust here, and over a long period of time, we think they are part of the picture of what we can do to change the pattern of some of these repressive policies and practices that countries have.
I thank you. I mean, I think a lot of us have ancestors that were religious freedom migrants.
I can assure you that's true.
And so it means something to us, and therefore it means something to folks in other countries that lose one of the most cherished rights of all. So we appreciate what you're doing. I'm frustrated sometimes by our lack of economic will, but I certainly have nothing but respect and admiration for what you're doing, and I yield back.
I really appreciate that. It's somebody who is part of a religious group that has known this kind of oppression time and again, century after century. We know the price of what happens when good people stand idly by, and this nation is committed not to repeat that mistake that has been made so many times before. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clausen. Vice Chairman of the Subcommittee, Mark Meadows.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to say this as delicately as I possibly can, Mr. Ambassador, but listening to your testimony, reconciling it with reality or perceived reality is very difficult to do. You know, you're saying we're doing extraordinary things. I think that was a quote, extraordinary things, and making extraordinary progress. And yet, when you talk to people on the ground, when you talk to others, they believe that the State Department doesn't make this a priority. How would you respond to that criticism?
Yeah, I truly don't believe I said anything about extraordinary progress.
But to
These are daunting,
to Mr.
daunting-
Cicilline, you did, but that's okay.
I-
I listened very carefully, but go ahead.
Okay,
I'll let you retract.
So, if I said that, then, Mr. Meadows, I do retract that. This is, human rights is a very daunting agenda today. Everywhere across the globe, religious freedom is a daunting agenda today. Everywhere across the globe, it is very hard to get traction and to change long ingrained practices and policies that these countries have.
would you say that the
we are doing extraordinary things here? I am prepared to try and defend to you. I really believe that we are here. A lot of this in countries, the countries that are the worst countries, we can't talk about openly in terms of the programmatic stuff. We're investing large amounts of resources to help strengthen those who share our view, those who are the victims of these injustices here. And
So let me interrupt you. I only have a limited amount of time, so let me maybe re-clarify my question a little bit. You've talked about the use of tools. I think the GAO reports has cited in 2013 that this was not really a priority for the administration. Positions went unfilled. Special envoys were not put forth. We've heard testimony. I follow this very closely, and so that's why I'm saying, trying to reconcile your testimony with the myriad of testimony that I've heard before would suggest that it's not a priority, and are you saying that it is?
I am saying that it is. Okay. Whatever was true up until 2013, certainly from the time that I have come on, the administration has lived up to every commitment and promise that it made to me and that it has made to the office. It has strengthened our work, our ability to work across the full range of efforts of this administration, and to have access to our highest levels with the Defense Department, the intelligence agencies, the full range of the State Department exceeds what I had hoped for.
But I guess here's my question is, I mean, some would suggest that the position went unfilled for over a year, so how could it be a priority?
I'm not the one to ask about being held accountable to what happened before I came on. You would have to ask others.
All right, so let me go a little bit further then, because you were talking about TPP, and as we have been involved in the negotiations with TPP, it seems like religious liberty and human rights is a sidebar, not anything that is and you would indicate that it's a priority with regards to our negotiation with the TPP deal. Is that your testimony here today? That it's priority? You know, it's a central focus of our trade agreement with these other countries?
Certainly in terms of Vietnam.
All right, so let me ask you this. What message does it send to the world when we change the rating of Malaysia without really anything significant happening as it relates to human trafficking? What message does that send?
Again, that is a question you would have to ask the people in the human trafficking office or that chain above them.
Is that not a human rights abuse?
Trafficking?
Yeah.
I devoted a lot of my career to addressing that issue. Okay. It is a very important human rights abuse, and the existence of the Human Trafficking Office, the existence of the report itself, whatever flaws you may see in particular pieces that happened this year, is itself testimony to the importance that
all right, let's go back to the religious liberty aspect then. Out of the over 750 pages of the proposed TPP, as we were reviewing it, what specific language in there gives you great comfort that we're going to address this as a priority as a nation? Specific language.
I can't answer that.
Have you read?
I cannot answer that, but I can get back to you.
Have you read the TPP deal?
I've read the parts of it that deal with some of the issues we're talking about here. So I only know what our face-to-face negotiations with the Vietnamese government have been like. Some of the commitments they've made that they've never made before. Some of the treaties they're signing they've never signed before. Here, is it everything we would want? No. Does it feel like it is providing traction to make a difference that will help workers, that will help disabled people here, that will help minorities there? I think it does.
So you mentioned Iran, and I'll close with this because I don't ever go anywhere without bringing it up. What's happening with Pastor Saeed Abedini? I mean, I don't know that there's any more of a poster face of religious liberty and what it is and what it is not, other than Pastor Saeed Abedini, and yet our whole political capital has been invested and nothing has happened.
We can't control, in the end, what countries that are bad actors are going to do in general or on any single thing. We can try and influence it. We can use every means at our hand to try and affect the outcome of these. You have seen the release of prisoners of conscience over the last years in different countries that have been problematic actors, that have been named CPCs in this area. It is not that we are not working on it day in and day out to try and get the release of these prisoners of conscience. The President has spoken publicly about Saeed Abedini and met with the family. The Secretary has spoken publicly about him, met with the family. We know there have been reports, it's not a secret, that on the sidelines in the negotiations on the Iran agreement, here we were raising this almost every time that there was a meeting. Every avenue that we have, either directly ourselves or through intermediaries who have closer relations with Iran, we are using to help all of the political prisoners, the American citizens there and others who are the prisoners of conscience, to have them released.
Well, I'll close with this one rhetorical question. Is if $140 billion in sanction relief can't get one pastor out of Iran, how much will it take? I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Meadows. We will be submitting a number of questions to you, Rabbi Sapperstein, including the whole issue of double hatting of sanctions, indefinite waivers. Your CERF has recommended that you end the practice. I would add exclamation points to their recommendation to that. And in regards to Saeed Abedini, we've had hearings in this committee. I've chaired them. We've heard from Mahkmeh, who was deeply disappointed with the State Department, not you, State Department. Originally, she said they told her there's nothing we can do, quote unquote. She was aghast at that, couldn't believe it. Frank Wolf actually convened a Lantos Commission hearing, the first one we had, and Secretary Kerry did respond, and we were all grateful for that. But I asked the Secretary, again, sitting right where you're sitting, why it wasn't integrated into the talks. On the sidelines means that it's on the sidelines, and it has no real bearing on this, what I consider a catastrophic deal that was signed with Iran. But if we're going to sign it, at least get the Americans out. And they got away with, and they're continuing to grossly mistreat them. I had a hearing here, Mr. Ambassador, with North Korea, several of them, but one of them, we had Andrew Natsios testify. You remember Andrew, he's used to be the head of USAID, he did disaster relief. Well, it was on North Korea, and he said, why didn't we learn the lesson in North Korea that when we were talking, even in the six-party talks about nuclear issues, which we failed at, we never brought up human rights. It was always way over on the fringes, if that. And he said that lesson should have been learned with regards to Saeed Abedini and the other Americans are being held. It should have been right there, front and center, and it was not. And now our ability to obtain his and the others' release has been greatly diminished. Trent Franks, who's chairman of the Religious Freedom Caucus for the House, has joined us. Chairman Franks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be incredibly brief here. You know that whatever the chairman has said, I agree with every syllable, and so it saves me a lot of time. But I do want to just underscore how significant your presence here is today, and of course the underlying cause being, in my judgment, critical to any kind of freedom. If we're going to survive, if we don't have religious freedom, all other freedoms go with it. And there's a wonderful cadre of some of the heroes in my heart and life behind you Dr. Yeah, I just see so many good people there. And so I'm looking forward to their testimony. One of the things I guess I would hope that would be part of the discussion is that as we Americans are deeply committed to this cause of religious freedom, and we want to make sure we export it to the world, and it's one of our greatest gifts that we can give them. We want to make sure that we don't see it undermined and diminished in our own country, and right now I think that that is a sincere concern. So I guess my question to you, if that's is that appropriate, Mr. Chairman? My question to you is, how do we make sure that we protect religious freedom in our own country, and then of course, how do we make sure that we export it appropriately? What do you think is the biggest threat to religious freedom domestically, and what's the answer to it? What's the biggest way that we can then export that religious freedom to other countries?
As the chairman in introducing me noted, I spent 35 years as a sideline of my life teaching religion law and church state law at Georgetown Law School, and spent much of my life dealing with religious freedoms domestically. Here, it is an issue of great personal concern for me, but as representing the United States government, my sole portfolio is dealing with international religious freedom. I can think of many good people in the administration and the Justice Department who can answer those questions directly. It would not be appropriately for me, as much as I care about that issue, it would not be appropriate for me.
I understand perfectly, and Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield back, but I'll just express to you that I think if we can protect religious freedom, all other freedoms will ultimately be extended. If
that
we
we
fail
could not agree more.
religious freedom, I think all other freedoms die with it.
Again, on that basis, Mr. Franks, first, thank you for your leadership on this issue. It's been extraordinary. But on that basis, I assure you, the administration feels as strongly as you do that our fundamental rights, as depicted in the Constitution, begin with freedom of religion. It is a foundation stone on which other rights depend, and it is one of the reasons I've devoted my life.
Well, and I thank you for that devotion. God bless you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Franks. Ambassador Sapperstein, thank you very much. We do appreciate your testimony and look forward to working with you going forward.
Thank you.
I'd like to now welcome to the witness table Dr. Robbie George, who is chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. He is the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. He has served on the President's Council on Bioethics and as a presidential appointee to the United States Commission on Civil Rights. A graduate of Swarthmore College and Harvard Law School, Professor George also earned a master's degree in theology from Harvard and a doctorate in philosophy of law from Oxford University. Without objection, his full resume and that of David Eberstein will be made a part of the record. I would note that appreciate your staff being here, including Katrina Lantos-Sweat, who has served as chair of the commission herself and remains on the commission, Annette Lantos, and of course we're always joined in this committee by the great presence of Tom Lantos's wonderful portrait, who served as chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Dr. George.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a great honor to be here, and I want to thank you and the distinguished members of this subcommittee for holding the hearing. The topic could not be more important or timely. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for everything you have done for human rights, and in particular for religious liberty in your public life. You've been a great inspiration to me personally. I know I speak for other members of my commission in saying that, and all of us are happy for the opportunity to be partnering with you and with your colleagues to advance this great cause. I want to say that I miss Congressman Frank Wolf. So often in the past when I've been here to testify, he's been here, and what a towering figure in the cause of human rights and especially religious freedom Frank Wolf continues to be, although he's no longer a member of Congress, of course. He's still out there literally doing the Lord's work on behalf of religious freedom. I was down at Baylor recently, where, of course, he has been installed in a new endowed chair down there. He continues, as you know, to take great personal risks, going to the worst places in the world to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable, the powerful, the oppressors. I feel his spirit in this room. I also can't help but feel the spirit of Tom Lantos and Henry Hyde, two great champions of human rights who are appropriately memorialized here in this room. I also want to say that it's a great honor to be speaking just after Rabbi Ambassador Sapperstein. David is not only a dear friend, but he too is a great champion of the cause. I strongly supported his confirmation as ambassador at large, and when he was confirmed, I will admit to giving a cheer, because I knew we would have in the administration, in that crucial role, someone who would be working night and day, literally tirelessly for our cause. Now, I'm a realist. I've been around. I know that in a bureaucracy, in an administration, there are difficulties, there are challenges, there are competing considerations. The Voice for Religious Liberty has to compete with voices for many, many other things, many legitimate things. But I knew that I would be able to sleep peacefully at night, knowing that there was someone there who would be doing everything I would be doing if I were there. There's no man that I would prefer in that position to David Sapperstein. So I'm just delighted that he's there, and it is an honor to follow him at this microphone. Thank you for recognizing my colleague and predecessor as chairman, Katrina Lantos Sweat, another great champion of religious liberty. I want to mention that we're here, Chairman Smith, with our wonderful executive director, Jacqueline Walcott, and several members of our staff. I would boast that we have the finest staff in the United States government. It's a small team, but what consummate professionals and dedicated people who are genuinely dedicated to the cause of religious freedom. And I just find it a privilege every day to be working with them. And I'm delighted to be here on International Religious Freedom Day. This is a day to celebrate. I know we're all, as Congressman Franks rightly mentioned, I think Congressman Netto's mentioned, others have mentioned, we are all at a certain level just depressed about the state of religious freedom in the world. I'm going to go into that in a minute, just how bad the situation is. But we do have something to celebrate, and that is that this nation in the International Religious Freedom Act, which you were so instrumental, which Frank Wolf was so instrumental, many of you so instrumental in getting us, this nation has committed itself not only to religious freedom at home, but also to treating that what we believe to be a universal value as something that every human being on the face of the earth is entitled to, because as Henry Hyde taught us, every human being is the bearer of a profound, inherent, and equal dignity. That's the foundation of our rights. There's no right more central than the right to religious freedom. So we should take a moment, even as we recharge the battery to redouble our efforts in the face of so many adversities on the religious freedom front, we should take a moment to celebrate today and to thank people like the chairman who were so instrumental in getting the act through. Now, of course, one of the reasons we're here today is that religious freedom remains under serious and sustained assault across the globe, whether we're talking about North Korea or China or Vietnam, across to Iran, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, obviously Syria, and Iraq, over to Egypt, Nigeria, Central African Republic, Cuba, problems in Russia. Almost everywhere we look, we see severe assaults on religious freedom. So we have to be the people who are standing up for it. And while I'm under strictures very similar to those under which Rabbi Sapperstein is operating, I will say, Congressman Franks, that I think we should all agree that the very best way we can promote religious freedom abroad is to honor it vigilantly at home. I think we should all be on the page for that one. Now, the most recent Pew study reports that approximately 3/4 of the world's people live in countries in which religion is either significantly restricted, the free exercise of religion is significantly restricted, or people are subjected to brutality by non-governmental actors, mobs, thugs, terrorists, where people are living insecurely in respect of their basic human right to religious freedom. And that's quite an indictment of our current circumstances. We're also here today because religious freedom matters so much, a pivotal human right central to our own history and affirmed, of course, in international treaties and other instruments. It's also crucial to our security and to the security of the world. Religious freedom issues and religious freedom violations are central to the narratives of countries that top the U.S. foreign policy and security agendas. Effectively promoting religious freedom can help the U.S. achieve crucial goals by fostering respect for human rights while promoting stability and ultimately national security. So what I'm saying to you is we have a moral principle at stake here which we should vie for with all our might, and that is the basic fundamental human right to religious liberty, rooted in the dignity of the human person. We also have an additional motive, though, which is that the security and stability that we want for ourselves and therefore need in the world is in play, at risk when religious freedom is undermined abroad. If we want peace and stability in the world and at home, we're going to need to promote religious freedom abroad. So today I want to focus on the following. First, how the International Religious Freedom Act has been used and should be used. Second, what the CPC process is, the countries of particular concern process is. And third, recommendations that our commission has for promoting international religious freedom. Now, the IRFA law seeks to make religious freedom an important part of U.S. policy priority by, among other measures, creating governmental institutions to monitor and report on religious freedom violations in the countries of the world. Within the State Department, we've got an ambassador-at-large position, of course the position that's currently held with great distinction by our friend, Rabbi Ambassador Sapperstein, and the Office of International Religious Freedom. And outside the executive branch, the independent, nonpartisan United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, mandated to review religious freedom violations and make recommendations to the President, the Secretary of State, and the Congress. The law gave teeth to this effort by requiring the government, the U.S. government, to designate countries of particular concern, CPCs, thereby naming, perhaps shaming, the worst foreign government violators, those that engage in or tolerate systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations. That's the statutory standard. That's the language, systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations, and take appropriate actions in response to create incentives for improvement in religious freedom respect and disincentives for inaction or failures on the religious freedom front, or further failures. Now, unfortunately, neither Republican nor Democratic administrations have adequately utilized this mechanism, with designations being too often infrequent and the CPC list largely remaining the same, when changes would, one would think, indicate some changes in CPC designations. Moreover, administrations generally have not levied new presidential actions, but relied on pre-existing sanctions. With such so-called double hatting, the chairman introduced the concept in his opening remarks, double hatting providing little incentive for governments to reduce or halt egregious violations or waived any consequences of the designations. Designating CPC countries without additional consequences, you just make the designation, no additional consequences, obviously limits the value of doing the designations. And the CPC process, as a result, loses credibility, especially when the designations are erratic. The other thing we need to avoid is having a designation never reviewed, so that, to quote my dear colleague, Dr. Lantos Sweat, the designation becomes part of the wallpaper. Nobody just notices it's there anymore. Just life goes on. So we need these designations made in a timely manner. I'd like to see them made annually in connection with the report. And I know David's working on that, and I appreciate that, David, very much, the work that David is doing to make sure that the administration and future administrations, Republican or Democrat, as the chairman says, this is not a partisan deal. This administration and future administrations will make those designations in a timely manner and a regular manner. The designation process and the possibility of punitive actions can breathe new life into diplomatic efforts that should both precede and follow a designation and stimulate political will in foreign capitals. One of USCIRF's chief responsibilities is to recommend the CPC designations to the State Department. We've recommended that the following 8 countries be redesignated: Burma, China, Eritrea, Iran, North Korea, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. USCIRF also recommended that 8 others also be designated: Central African Republic, Egypt, Iraq, Nigeria, Pakistan, Syria, Tajikistan, and Vietnam. While my written testimony, which I will submit, Mr. Chairman, deals with 3 countries, Vietnam, Pakistan, and Tajikistan, and my oral statement here focuses on Vietnam in a moment, it's important to note that Pakistan, democratic nation, Pakistan, is the worst situation in the world for religious freedom for countries not currently designated as CPCs. I also want to say that not designating Tajikistan underscores the Religious Freedom Act's inconsistent implementation. I just learned from our excellent expert, Kathy Kosman, on Central Europe, that the situation in Tajikistan, horrific already, is deteriorating still further. More abuses, tortures, people being hauled away. These are exactly the kinds of atrocities that the Act is supposed to empower us to fight against. All right, now Vietnam. USCIRF's August 2015 visit reinforces our view that Vietnam falls short of meeting international religious freedom standards. The Vietnamese government controls nearly all religious activities, restricts independent religious practice, and represses individuals and groups challenging its authority. Rabbi Sapperstein filled you in on some of the additional details and the nuances that one finds there today. Vietnam provides us with a case study of the impact that a CPC designation can have in encouraging improvements, and reinforces how such a designation does not disrupt progress in other areas. So I'm going to actually repeat here and maybe add a little more color and detail to a story that the chairman recounted in his opening remarks. In 2006, so we're going back to the Bush administration, Bush 43, the United States removed Vietnam's CPC designation due to the country's progress toward fulfilling a bilateral agreement to release prisoners and expand legal protection for religious groups. Many attributed, I think rightly, looking back on it, this progress to the CPC designation, at least in part, and to the priority placed on religious freedom concerns in the U.S.-Vietnam bilateral relations. In other words, it worked. USCIRF's view that lifting the designation was premature has been reinforced and confirmed by the Vietnamese government's actions since then, and USCIRF thus recommended in 2015, as it has since 2001, that Vietnam be designated a CPC. We're going to move now to my recommendations. Again, more details in the written submission, Mr. Chairman. Congress has an essential role to play in promoting religious freedom. That was part of the premise of the IRFA Act, and it's absolutely true. USCIRF urges members of Congress to undertake activities that reflect religious freedom's vital importance to our foreign policy, including by the following means. 1, legislatively, requiring the State Department to make annual CPC designations. I think that is something that would be very helpful. Let's just mandate the annual designations. Then it's the law, get it done, move forward. I don't see any reason not to do that. Number 2, annually hold IRFA implementation oversight hearings. Very good thing to do, for obvious reasons. 3, expand the CPC classification, as the chairman already mentioned, and I believe Rabbi Sapperstein mentioned, to allow for the designation of countries where particularly severe violations of religious freedom are occurring, but a government does not exist, or is not strong enough, or doesn't control its territory. If we look out in the world, we see sometimes the big offenders are states that are run by thugs and criminals who are hell-bent on violating other people's religious freedom, persecuting minorities, oppressing the people. Sometimes there's nothing a government can do about it because there's no government there. You got a failed state, or the government's so weak that it can't actually do anything even if it wanted to. And then expand the CPC classification, again, the chairman mentioned this, to allow the naming of non-state actors who perpetrate particularly severe violations of religious freedom. that may assist in a variety of ways, including in respect of international financial transactions. I also urge Congress to hold hearings in support of civil society and prisoners of conscience abroad. And I want all members of Congress, I think those who are here with us today are already doing it, so bravo. But I'd like to see all members of Congress participate in our Defending Freedoms project, our collaborative effort with the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission and Amnesty International and USERF, whereby members of Congress work in support of prisoners of conscience. I think you shouldn't underestimate what the identification of a particular prisoner of conscience, whether it's in North Korea, Iran, Saudi Arabia, wherever it is, don't underestimate what the identification with a particular congressman who makes it part of his or her task, mission, vocation, to make sure that person's not forgotten. Make sure that somebody's paying attention, perhaps in the media, perhaps in diaspora communities. It also is a kind of moral support, not only for that individual and for that individual's family, which is very important, but again, often for the supporters, for the diaspora groups, for the members of that faith. We can and will see constructive change by improving our use of the existing tools and creating the new tools I've mentioned for a rapidly changing environment for religious freedom and related rights. If we renew our resolve, and that's what we need to do, renew our resolve to integrate this fundamental freedom more fully into the foreign policy of our nation, we can bring protection and support to many, many more people beyond our shores who yearn for the freedom that we have and must preserve. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Dr. George. We have about a minute left on this vote, and there's 4 votes, and can I inquire what your time looks like? We would come back if you would.
Would you like me to wait until you come back? I'd be happy to do that, Mr. Chairman.
I'd probably ask one question to start it off, and
Absolutely.
then we'll reconvene. In talking about Vietnam, I remember meeting with Ambassador at Large John Hanford several times, and he often talked about the deliverables, whether it be Saudi Arabia, which was making a great deal of suggestive noise that somehow they would clean up their textbooks, and much of their support that we found very objectionable, particularly the Wahhabis, would be reined in on, but especially on the textbook issue. And with Vietnam, the deliverables were quite extensive. And I went over to Vietnam, met with a number of pastors. There was a great deal of optimism and hope. And again, as I said a few moments ago to Rabbi Sapperstein, almost the day after, there was a snapback retaliatory repression against the faith believers. The Vietnamese are doing now exactly what the Chinese learned long ago to do, and they're just parroting that, and that is signing into UN conventions and treaties, or at least suggesting that they would, which are not enforceable. They're all, they exhort, they have no means of enforcement. So it looks good, but I lost track of the number of times when the Chinese used to come here, a Chinese leader, and they say, now we're going to sign the International Covenant on Political and Civil Rights, but they didn't do it, and then they didn't do it, and then a year would go by, somebody else would come in, and they would talk about signing another. My point is, how do you make this durable? CPC just means we designate what the administration does in follow-up is part 2, and ought to be done based on a calibrated response to deeds, not words. And I'm very concerned that we ought to just get it right on TPP, on CPC. And one word about TPP. I went in that secret room and read the agreement, was appalled at the unenforceability of the human rights section, so-called, especially as it relates to labor rights, which you would have thought, with labor heavily weighing in on the administration to do the right thing and to follow true ILO standards in an enforceable fashion, it's just not there. It's left up to the country itself to deem what needs to be done in any situation, rather than, it puts at risk our ability on CPC, on trafficking, and on other human rights issues to enforce it. I'm wondering now, if whether or not we can actually enforce some of our current laws when it comes to human rights with regards to the TPP countries, the signatory countries. So it could be a massive setback, not an advancement. But You know, this idea of designation of CPC ought to be a no-brainer based on the facts on the ground, and then let them, you know, the administration decide what to do, from a simple demarche to a whole bunch of other things that could be done.
Well, Congressman Smith, I'm hoping to learn more soon about why some of these offending nations will sign on to treaties that they, especially human rights conventions, that they have no intention of abiding by, or sometimes decline to sign. And it's hard to know why they sometimes decline to sign, sometimes sign but ignore. But as it happens, my daughter Rachel George, who's doing her PhD at the London School of Economics in International Relations, is writing her dissertation on exactly this question. Wow. So I hope to learn something, and I'll share it with you when Rachel produces the goods. But it's
we're at 0, and could you just hold that
Yes,
thought?
absolutely.
Quick recess, and then we'll come back.
Wait,
And I
back.
thank you for your patience. No hurry. The subcommittee will resume its sitting, and I apologize for that rather lengthy delay, but Dr. George, you were in the middle of an answer, I know, so maybe you were done or no?
Good. Yes, Mr. Chairman, you had asked about nations that sign on to human rights treaties and conventions, but then just flout them, because there obviously is no international human rights law enforcement mechanism. My day job is as a legal philosopher, and one of the great questions in my field of philosophy of law is whether international law is really law, since we don't have, in so many cases at least, formal enforcement mechanisms, international police forces. We do have international courts, but of course they're limited in their jurisdiction. So what do? Well, we incentivize good behavior and disincentivize bad behavior in the construction and execution of our foreign and diplomatic policy. That's what we do. We can't act for the world, but we can act for ourselves. The United States really matters. It's very important. We have a big impact on other countries. How we treat them matters to them, especially when it comes to trade or geostrategic and military concerns. And that's why, Mr. Chairman, we cannot, and this was the spirit behind IRFA, as you know, since you were so significant in it. The spirit behind IRFA is the spirit that says trade considerations, geostrategic and military considerations, those are important, those do matter. It's important that there be powerful lobbies for those interests, and there will be. The question is, will there be an equally or similarly powerful lobby for human rights, and especially for religious freedom? And what the IRFA law helps to do through the ambassadorship, through the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, is to ensure that there is a voice for religious freedom, a lobby for religious freedom at the table, speaking on behalf of the persecuted and the marginalized and the victims of discrimination and oppression. So all these mechanisms we've been talking about, Mr. Chairman, the CPC designations, avoiding the double hatting, making sure that waivers aren't institutionalized permanently in such a way that they undercut CPC designations. All these tools are mechanisms for doing exactly what I said, incentivizing good behavior and improvements, disincentivizing the bad behavior.
You pointed out that Pakistan has a very serious negative record when it comes to religious freedom, and I wonder if you might want to expand upon that. And without objection, your full statement will be made a part of the record. But when the Prime Minister was in town just a few days ago, I raised the issue, a number of them, but including Ms. Bibi, who's a Christian mother who got a stay of execution by the Supreme Court in July. But as we know, that can change, and there is an appeal going on. And I did ask the Prime Minister to use his good offices to intervene on her behalf, and to impress upon him how all of us are deeply concerned about the blasphemy laws, the Taliban having a tremendous amount of ability to do terrible things with very little pressure to stop. And I wonder if you might want to expand upon Pakistan, because I think a lot of people. So if you could speak to that.
Yes, I will, Mr. Chairman. As I mentioned in my testimony, Pakistan, in the view of our commission, represents the worst situation in the world for religious freedom for countries that are not currently designated a CPC by the U.S. government. So if we have several recommendations for CPCs for countries that are not currently CPCs, but at the very top of the list is Pakistan because of the scope and depth of the religious freedom abuses there. Since 2002, USCIRF has recommended CPC designation for Pakistan. That's a lot of years, and that's due to the government's systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of religious freedom and violations by the Taliban and by other non-state actors. So if you just read the statute, apply the law, ask the question, does Pakistan meet that standard, systematic, egregious, and ongoing? The answer is it does. So in our view, it really belongs on the CPC list. Now, of course, the State Department has never designated Pakistan as a CPC, despite its own IRF reports, despite our annual report at USIRF, and despite the lobbying and the support, the reports of non-governmental organizations, all of which document the severe religious freedom violations, the persecutions against a wide variety of groups, Mr. Chairman, including Sunni and Shia and Ahmadi Muslims. I want to especially highlight the mistreatment of Ahmadis in Pakistan, where the very constitutional law of the government systematically discriminates against them and violates their rights. They are forbidden to call themselves Muslims, even though in conscience they believe themselves to be Muslims. They can lose their right to vote. They're not allowed to greet each other or others with the traditional Muslim greeting of peace. And there are other groups, of course, that are victims, including Christians and Hindus. In March of this year, we sent a commissioner-level delegation to Pakistan. And what they found is, of course, all Pakistanis are deprived of fundamental and universal rights, including the right to freedom of religion and belief. And on the last day that our delegation was there, 2 churches in Lahore were attacked, leaving 15 people dead, as well as dozens of others injured. And, of course, you mentioned the blasphemy laws. Pakistan detains the greatest number of individuals for blasphemy of any country in the world. We're aware of 38 blasphemy prisoners as of our 2015 report. And the world, of course, has come to know Aisa Bibi, a Christian woman in jail since 2010, who faces the death penalty for blasphemy. But she's probably just the best well-known, the most well-known, the best known of what are in fact many. And it's for all those reasons, Mr. Chairman, that we believe great pressure needs to be brought to bear on Pakistan to improve its record on religious freedom. And until reforms are made, Pakistan deserves to be on the CPC list.
Let me just ask you if you are concerned, as I am, about conforming human rights designations to accommodate other political considerations. I mean, as I mentioned earlier to Rabbi Sapperstein, on the child abduction law, it was incredulous that Japan, even though it has more than 50 cases, according to the Center for Missing and Exploited Children, of abduction cases, was given a complete pass. And if you even have one that goes past the Hague Convention time of 6 weeks, one can get such a designation. But when you have 5, 10, 50, when you have 50, it's a no-brainer. And yet the State Department Office of Children's Issues that has obviously it takes the lead on this, gave Japan a pass. And Tier 3, I mentioned Malaysia, Vietnam, when it comes to, and Cuba, and now on CPC, Vietnam, and that seems to be driven in part by the TPP. The Commission's view on just getting it right in the report, and then reasonable men and women can disagree on what the sanction ought to be, although I think double-hatting it diminishes it greatly. But could you speak to that? Because, you know, this is a serious problem. And then we get these glib statements that somehow the TPP has human rights language in it. Let me just disabuse anybody who thinks that. Just read it. It is feckless. It is ineffective. It's not going to effectuate any kind of change because of what, you know, because there's little or no enforcement contained in it. I went and I read it, you know, and I would hope more people would. Maybe it's not public yet. It ought to be. But this idea that the different reports keep getting it wrong when the country in question has some other strategic geopolitical issue going for it.
Well, that's it. Of course, you put your finger on the problem. I think it's very important to get the rules and standards right. That's why I, at the time, so strongly supported the International Religious Freedom Act, and why I continue to support it, and why I support the efforts by you and others to update the Act and reform the Act, correct what needs to be corrected, bring it up to date with our contemporary challenges, for example, in the area of non-state actors and so forth. But getting the laws and the rules right is only half the battle. Now, it's a necessary half, because getting the job done will require getting the laws and the rules and the standards right as a necessary condition. What's the other half? It's political will, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
It's having the will to stand up for religious freedom precisely when there are competing considerations, when there are competing trade, economic considerations, military and geostrategic considerations. And I want to stress that none of us are belittling or denigrating those considerations. They're very important. We want prosperity for ourselves and for others. We want functioning markets. We want trade with all the nations in the world. We certainly want to be in a strong position as far as our national security is concerned. We want a strong military that is operating in relation to other countries properly throughout the world to ensure the security of the United States and the world to the extent that we have any responsibility for it or can affect it. But that should never be permitted to be an excuse for inaction, for the lack of political will to stand up for religious freedom and for other basic human rights. So we've got to muster the political will to do it. And where somebody points to language in a law or statute or points to a standard, when we've asked for action, I think you're right to say that's not enough. The pretty language doesn't get the job done for persecuted people and prisoners of conscience. You need the political will to act. But I just conclude on this point, Mr. Chairman, by saying that the beauty of democracy is that the people get to influence these sorts of things. And so I do hope that we as a people, not just our political leaders, but that we as a people will give the kind of priority that religious freedom deserves for the persecuted people of the world. And if we get that, there are going to be a lot of people sent up here and into other offices that will have the political will to get the job done.
Let me just ask you with regards to the UN system and whether or not the Commission interfaces with, whether it be the Human Rights Commission or the Council as it's called now, under Prince Zayed, or Zaid, I should say, or the UN Special Rapporteur on Religion, Professor Bielefeld. Does the Commission have contact with them? How do you find their work to be? Can you give any sense of its quality?
I'm not sure I heard the question. I don't want to make you...
The UN Special Rapporteur on Religion, is there any kind of interface with the Commission and his office and him?
Let me ask... Yeah, okay.
Okay.
They're hearing your question better than I am. It's the UN Rapporteur?
Yes.
That you're asking about? Yeah, okay. So our Commission does interact not only with the UN Rapporteur and other UN offices that are concerned with religious freedom, but also with our peer institutions in other countries, for example, in Canada and in some of the European countries. We also recently participated in and helped to organize an international parliamentarians panel, and we're grateful to you, Mr. Chairman, for providing a wonderful letter of greeting to the parliamentarians from all over the world who visited us in New York to talk about how legislative bodies in the democratic countries around the world could unite in the cause of religious freedom. So we have very good relations, and our staff has really been terrific about this in building relationships with others who are committed to the same cause, because it is, after all, international religious freedom. And while the United States can do an awful lot by way of our foreign and diplomatic policy, we're going to be able to do a lot more if we're coordinating with other nations, especially other influential, powerful, wealthy nations, but really with all nations, anybody who's willing to join us in the fight for international human rights. So we're doing, the bottom line there is that we're doing everything we can to work with anybody who's willing to work with us to advance this cause.
I have one final question, and I yield to Chairman Rohrbacher. And I will have to leave. I'm opening up a session on autism. Sesame Street today is designating one of their characters and will be an autistic child to try to raise the profile among young people. But let me just, the Frank Wolf International Religious Freedom Act, you support it?
Absolutely. Now, I guess I'd better speak for myself here and not for the whole commission, because we haven't had a vote of our commissioners. So let me step out of my official role as chairman and support it. I will note that the act includes many provisions that are almost identical to recommendations that we have as a commission made. So like our recommendations, these provisions would better equip our government to support international religious freedom. For example, it amends IRFA to locate the Office of International Religious Freedom in the Office of the Secretary of State. USERF believes that given the importance of the issue and the customary placement of the ambassador at large, that the IRF office ought to be given really more prominence in the State Department hierarchy. I suspect we're on the same page here, Mr. Chairman, wanting David Sapperstein to have as much influence as possible as he can there. But we'd want any ambassador whose job is to promote religious freedom to have the maximum amounts of influence and access. It specifies additional foreign government actions violating religious freedom for the ambassador's annual report on international religious freedom, including a special watch list of countries of violent non-state actors that have engaged in or tolerated such violations but don't yet quite meet the criteria for designation as countries of particular concern. That really corresponds roughly but closely to what we call our Tier 2 countries, countries like Russia, for example. It amends the Foreign Service Act of 1980 to direct the Secretary to develop a curriculum for and the Director of the George P. Shultz National Foreign Affairs Training Center to begin mandatory training on religious freedom for all Foreign Service officers. That's a very good idea. The officers who are our diplomatic corps really need to be educated on the importance of religious freedom as an essential human right and as a key to stability and security. I mean, one of the problems we've had, I'm not blaming anybody for this. I mean, if there's anybody to blame, it's those of us who are in the academic field. Those of us in the academic field cooked up a theory called secularization theory, or the secularization thesis. And this was the widely believed thesis for which there was some evidence. Turned out to be false, but there was some evidence for the theory that as modernity proceeded with industrialization and mass media and global economy, as modernization proceeded, religion would recede basically to the private sphere and be less and less a matter of public interest. So why did people who were training for careers in international affairs or diplomacy need to care much about religion? It would be just a private matter. Well, that turned out to be spectacularly false. We now know that religion is increasing in its public significance for good and for ill, which means that now that we know that that thesis is false, we also know that people who are going to be acting on our behalf in the international sphere, whether they are themselves devout or believers or not, need to have an appreciation and understanding of what religion is and how it works and of the importance of religious freedom, both as a right that we as a country are deeply committed to in our very founding principles, but also as part of the solution to instability and insecurity. We talked about the waivers and double hatting, and I think your bill would be a big help in strengthening the IRFA tools there to make sure that they're not undercut by double hatting and by waivers that are given indefinitely and without conditions. Your bill also states that it should be U.S. policy that violent non-state actors should be eligible for designation as countries of particular concern, and that specified presidential actions should apply to them or individual members of such groups. We at USERF strongly support that. I can speak for everybody on that one. The world has changed. The world is not what it was in 1998. It wasn't a mistake in 1998. It's just that things have changed, and now the Act needs to be updated to just deal with the reality in the world, a reality in which we are facing the Islamic State, we're facing Boko Haram, non-state actors in those and other places that are just really wreaking devastation. I could go on, Mr. Chairman, but my written, I know you have to go, and my written submission will go into more detail about these matters.
Thank you so very much. Dr. George, thank you for your exemplary leadership on these issues, both as head of USERF, but also in all of the other work that you do. I've watched it and admired it for decades. So I want to thank you. I'd like to yield to Chairman Rohrabacher, who will take over the hearing.
I'll make this
I
very
thank
quick.
you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, what 5 nations would you consider to be the worst abusers of religious freedom?
I'm having, is it the worst 5 nations
The worst 5 nations.
for religious freedom?
Yes.
Yeah. There are so many good candidates, I'm afraid, Congressman Rohrabacher, that it's hard to narrow it down to 5. But let me give it a first stab on some reflection. I might alter it a bit at the edges. But North Korea is a terrible violator.
Okay. Got that. North Korea?
China, such a large country, and so many people from so many different religious groups, so brutally repressed. The Buddhists in Tibet and elsewhere, the Catholics, the house church Protestants, the Falun Gong members, the Uyghur Muslims.
Okay.
The regime in Tehran, I have to say, is a world-class religious freedom abuser. So Iran has to be considered among the worst.
So there are not Christian churches in Iran, and they can't function, or people?
Well, yeah, there are Christians in Iran, but of course they're subject to the same persecution that any minority group, religious minority group, is subject to in Iran.
Would Pakistan be on the list?
Pakistan is the worst offending nation of those not currently designated as CPCs, which means that they would be in the top 10. Whether they would be in the top 5, I'd want to give that a little bit of
I would
reflection.
suggest that if there's anything that Pakistan is not on the list, if they're not on the list, it demonstrates that for whatever reason, Pakistan has been protected for some other motives by our government over these last 25, 30 years. During the Cold War.
And we would note that whatever those reasons are, and perhaps they're good reasons, since they haven't been shared with me, I can't evaluate their strength. But I would note that it's not partisan, because
Oh, yeah, sure.
Pakistan, we have been recommending CPC designation going back into the early years of the Bush administration.
Well, during the Cold War, the Pakistanis their government were involved with
That's
the
right.
Cold War. They were our allies, and India was basically an ally of Russia during the Cold War. The Cold War has been over a long time now, and the monstrous repression of the people of Pakistan who have differing religious views from the ruling clique, that whoever rules there, is very demonstrable. And now, do they have Ahmadis, or is that?
Yeah, and let me say a word about that.
Not just Christians, but there's Ahmadis, there's other Muslims that are being murdered.
Yes.
And this is horrendous. It is horrendous that that's going on, and yet we still provide weapons to Pakistan. Not to mention, of course, they thumb their nose at us by putting Dr. Afridi, the man who identified Osama bin Laden for us. He's in a dungeon right now, even as we give F-16 fighters to Pakistan. And of course, the same group that threw Dr. Afridi in jail were the same people who gave Osama bin Laden a safe haven for the man who slaughtered 3,000 Americans. There's something really wrong there. And I hope that people, that they won't pay attention to the strategic things like their support of someone who was involved in the 9/11 attacks. Maybe they'd have some heart for other people, just ordinary people who are being murdered and slaughtered because they just want to pray to God in a different way.
Chairman Smith mentioned Abati earlier. There have been some great heroes who have tried to stand up against the persecution there at the cost of their very lives or their liberty. And it's not just the regime when it comes to Pakistan, which is, after all, a democratic nation. If you look at the persecution of the Ahmadis and of other minorities, including Christians, we have a cultural problem there as well. It's similar to, I think, what you yourself pointed to in Burma, or one of the congressmen pointed to in Burma earlier. Yeah, where the cultural prejudice against minorities, and particularly in this case the Ahmadis, is very powerful. It's not just the government. The anti-Ahmadi provisions of the very constitution of the nation are there because of public attitudes, really. And sometimes when, we're in touch with officials and we're trying to bring pressure to bear on officials, they will say to us, well, you don't know what you're asking because we've got a civil society to deal with here, and we can't just put into place policies that would be easier on our minorities because the people won't tolerate it. We hear this from the Saudis, by the way.
Oh,
When
yeah,
we
I
talk
would-
about the
sure,
need,
of
you know,
course.
for respect for, there are a lot of Christian guest workers, Filipinos and others in Saudi Arabia who would like to be able to carry their Bibles or have a church. On the whole Saudi Arabian Peninsula, there's no church, there's no Christian church, right? Why can't they? Well, we confront Saudi officials and they say, well, maybe we would like to make some reforms here and make it a little easier for these people to practice their faith, but you know, our civil society wouldn't permit it. I mean, it just couldn't fly given the sociology of our people here.
Yeah.
And I think we just can't accept that. We cannot accept that.
Correct.
These regimes are responsible for making the reforms that protect the human rights, including the fundamental right of religious freedom, of all the people within their jurisdictions, including their minority citizens and guests.
I remember during the Cold War having to sit down with people who were representing communist governments who always had these excuses and were never willing to admit just how oppressive they really were. I think it's time that we insisted that they face this reality of what Marxism, Leninism was all about. I think it's time that there are many millions of Muslims around the world, many, if not most, who could be friends and be open to these kind of ideas of accepting people and not oppressing somebody simply because they worship God in a different way. We need to call to task the Saudis and the Pakistanis and these other people who have supposedly been on our side and quit putting up with this, quit trying to treat them with kid gloves because it ain't going to work. These regimes are basically gangster regimes in terms of the way they treat their people. And it shouldn't be tolerated, and the United States has done that. Shame on us. Thank God for you and Chris Smith and other people who've committed their lives to exposing those people who are, stepping on the religious freedom of other human beings. Thank you very much for being with us today. And I think I'm supposed to gavel this down. This hearing is now adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me know if I can help you or if our commission can help you, if our staff can help you. Okay. You guys are great and we want to help any way we can. Thanks for what you're doing. Good. Bye-bye. Good trip back. Thanks. I just want to say I was going to go back to the office and drop stuff off. You look so familiar. Yeah. Oh, okay. Graduated back in 09. Oh, good. And are you working up here on the Hill? I actually